Hi, this is Dale from vhorizon.co.uk. Today we're going to talk about Citrix StoreFront user farm mapping. This video is going to be broken down into four sections. Firstly, we're going to have a quick overview on what user farm mapping actually is, some of the constraints around it, etc. Then we're going to outline three simple use cases for user farm mapping. And then I'm going to go through a configuration demo for you, show it to my lab storefront servers, etc., and how it works. And then finally, we're going to have a look at some common error messages that you might see when you're configuring user farm mapping. So, user farm mapping, it's a feature of Citrix StoreFront, and it allows you to specify and control which farms and sites are enumerated against based upon a user's Active Directory group memberships. It's a configuration that's XML based, so you have to actually use Notepad or Notepad++, to actually edit the web config file within a storefront store. It also locks out your ability to manage delivery controllers and farm sites within the GUI once you've entered a user farm mapping configuration into the webconf file, because the webconf file is very sensitive to change. So if you make an amendment in the GUI and you haven't updated user farm mapping, that can break it. There are some tag configurations that you need to change outside of the user farm mapping code block, which I'll go into later, and also it's very case sensitive in places. So if you get errors when a particular user logs in that should be hitting user farm mapping configuration, then it's likely that there's a case sensitivity issue there somewhere. So without further ado, let's have a look at some of the scenarios that I'm going to be configuring in this video. So the first scenario we're going to look at is the load balance configuration. This basically controls the enumeration pathways that you take once you configure user farm mapping for load balancing. If you have two separate sites and user 1 logs into StoreFront, for example, then the enumeration request is going to go through StoreFront and down to site 1 within this example. Then when user 2 comes in, the authentication is going to happen at StoreFront and the enumeration request is going to go through to site 2. User 3, then it'll go back to site 1, etc., etc. We'll keep flip-flopping in that particular fashion. Quite simple, and it's an additional method of load balancing provided over and above all the other load balancing points within an infrastructure. So the second scenario we're going to have a look at is a failover configuration. This basically provides you with a live HQ and DR site configuration within StoreFront. So you can put both sites within the managed delivery controllers section of the StoreFront GUI, and then you specify the primary HQ site on the left hand side, and then underneath that you'll have the DR site. So within a failover configuration, all your users will be enumerating against the HQ site on the left hand side in the diagram, and as soon as that fails or anything changes and the requests aren't being honoured by the HQ site, then that will fail over to the DR site. This configuration has an added benefit for DR. StoreFront would treat these two sites as an active and passive, but you can pre-populate them within StoreFront, and also all the applications, etc., can be published within both sites, but the user will only see the applications and desktops from the HQ site until that fails, and then it fails over to the DR site. And finally, we're going to have a look at the aggregator configuration. This allows you to specify two separate sites or farms, both with identical applications published to them. But you can actually use, while utilizing keywords within the published application, you can specify which version and which site of the application you'd actually prefer the user to see. So if in this example you've got both sites have a copy of Word and Excel published, if you use the keyword primary and the keyword secondary in the separate sites, the primary icons will always show unless there's an issue, and then it'll show you the ones from the secondary site. So this is quite good in utilizing a production and UAT kind of setup. So if your primary site is the UAT site, for example, and you make changes to an application, so if we've made some add-in configuration within Word and we want to test it to our users, we can specify user group that this aggregation will apply to. and then when they log in, they'll get the modified, newer version of Word from the primary site, or if it's not available, they'll see the standard version of Word that everybody else is using from the secondary site. So, moving on to my lab, I'll give you a quick brief rundown of what I've got working at the moment. I've got this VM here, which is my single domain controller. I've got one separate Zen Desktop 7.6 site here, and under here I've got another separate Zen Desktop 7.6 site. If we go through into Active Directory, I've created 2 user accounts. One called User HK and another called User SP. Each of these individually are in specified groups with the same suffix, just called Group SP or Group HK. And it's those groups that I'm going to be using to gather to create the user file mapping configuration. Now, as I mentioned before, within the configuration you need this security identifier of the group that you're going to be using. An easy way to get that is using a PowerShell command called get AD group, and then you do a variable of identity, and then you put in the group name, and then you get all the information you possibly need, including the security identifier of the group. So, moving on to StoreFront. As you see, I've got a basic configuration here. All I've done is I've run through the initialization wizard. When you create a new store, there's no other customizations whatsoever. Within the store, I've got 2 separate delivery controllers configured. I've given them a friendly name of Zen Desktop 1 and Zen Desktop 2. You can see there's only a single delivery controller in each. So this is a lab, none of it's actually best practice, shall we say, so it is what it is, but they provision out, my Zen Desktop 7.6 server here provisions out a single desktop called FrameHawk, and the other one provisions out a desktop called Applications, and a small number of very basic applications too. And that's what we're going to be using to actually demo this environment. So we can start to demo this to you by, if I log on as one of those users, let's pick Hong Kong, for example, HK, put in the password, and you should see there I've got familiar view. So I've got an applications which is coming from the Windows Server 2012 farm, and the other one is coming from the 7.6 farm. I've got these applications published to me. So at this point, when you log in, StoreFront sends enumeration requests to both delivery controllers specified within this store. Well, we want to change that behavior with user file mapping. Okay, so the only other things that I've done behind the scenes is I've created 2 text files on the desktop of the StoreFront server for my ease and swiftness of the demo. So I've got the code block here from my blog post, and I've additionally already retrieved the SIDs, etc. from the grouping structure in another text file. So without further ado, let's have a look at configuring user file mapping. Okay, so we're going to open Notepad as administrator. If you don't do this, it won't allow you to save the configuration once you've done it, which can be highly irritating. Okay, so we're just going to open up the store location. So you can see here everything's in default locations. I've got the init pub, www, Citrix, the store name, user file mapping. No, it's not the UFM web that would be created by default, it's just the UFM store. So if we change that to all files, then open up the web config file. Now, if we look for a specific point in our configuration, if we look for resources wing configuration, okay, so here we are. Now the first thing we need to do as I mentioned in the blog post, is you need to remove this leading slash. So we'll do that, and then input a space there. Then next we need to add in the initial opening of the user farm mapping configurations. So in the blog post it's detailed that you put in the user farm mapping tag and then a clear tag, so that's copied in. Next thing we need to do is we need to copy in our code block. So if we open up the code block that I've already copied from my blog post, we'll copy that, go back to the other, paste that in there. Now if you're only going to configure one user farm mapping, then that's all you need to do. Otherwise you can paste this code block as many times as you like within this section. But for the time being I'm going to concentrate on one code block, then go back and build it up as we go. So I'm actually going to complete off the configuration by entering another couple of little bits of code at the end to close this code block. So what you'll see at the bottom here, you've got a slash user farm mapping to close off the individual code block. We want to close off the whole configuration, so we are going to put in the user farm mappings closing statement, and then additionally we are going to close off the resource win configuration by doing the similar thing. Spelling it correctly, of course. There. So you see here, there's a slight difference between the tags. We've got a resource ring configuration here, and underneath we've got resource ring configurations. So very minor points, but they do obviously make a big difference. So at the moment, I'm going to save this configuration just as it is. So once that's saved, as I mentioned in the blog post, this needs to be an individual name. So if you create additional user farm mappings, each one has to be an incrementer name or something else. It's just a friendly name. It doesn't actually have to mean anything, but clearly it makes sense for it to give it a name that means something to you. So on the groups, we're going to add in my HK group. So for example, we'll start by putting the domain, and we'll put in group HK, and then I've already pre-copied the SID from my text file. So let's go back to my config and paste that into there. So if you want to, you can have multiple group names specified in here just by copying this line and putting it in between that and the closing group statement. That actually, within a user farm mapping single configuration, that treats it as an AND statement. So if you have a member of the group -HK, and you also additionally put in another line with group -SP, then the user that's signing in only hits that user farm mapping if they're a member of both groups. Okay, so again, for the equivalent farm set name, this is another friendly name, so it doesn't have to reflect anything within the Zen desktop infrastructure or AD infrastructure. All it does is specify that there's a farm set that has identical applications published within inside it. So I'm just going to keep this at the fairly standard location 1. As we're going to do the first scenario outlined in the presentation, I'm going to set this to load balanced. And again, the aggregation group again is a friendly name, but I'm not going to use aggregation in this instance, so I'm just going to give it a default name. Let's say ag1 will do quite sufficiently. So within the primary farm refs tag, I've already got the empty but pre-populated command here. So this is where you enter in the names of the stores, and this has to reflect what is configured within StoreFront. So if you remember going back to StoreFront, I've got two separate farm sites specified. One's called Zen Desktop 1, one's called Zen Desktop 2. That has to match identically, so it's case sensitive in this instance. If it does not, and a user hits this rule, and there's a case sensitive issue here, then you'll get an error message when the user tries to log in. So if we do that, and I can copy that, and as we want a load balance configuration, I'm going to change that and add in another line to point to Zen Desktop 2. Okay, so the backup farm refs at the moment we can we can ignore. You put in farm names there if you want a certain site or farm to respond or to receive XML requests if anything you've entered in the primary farm refs have actually failed to respond to enumeration requests. And then that's basically it. So we just need to save that configuration. Okay, just as we were about to save, I've just realised that I've done a bit of a typo already, so I'm just going to correct that. So we put a closing statement in there and put the S on there. So it's file and save that web configuration. Okay, so now that we've saved the configuration, if we flip back to our StoreFront web UI, this particular user file mapping is configured for load balancing. So what we should see is when we log in as the HK user, they get a particular set of applications. If they log out and back in again, they'll get a different set of applications. Now, ideally, within the production environment, these applications should be identical across the two sites and farms, but within a lab environment, I think it's easier to see the effect if the applications are different. So, let's log in and let's hope this is configured correctly. So the first thing you'll notice is when I've logged in, instead of enumerating against both farms, we've lost the FrameHawk desktop, which is only published out from the Zen Desktop 7.6 farm. So we've got that and the apps in here. So now if we log out and back in again, okay, if we log back in again, what we'll see is that the applications tab has gone. The only desktop we've got available is the FrameHawk desktop. So that now shows us that the load balance is working correctly. It's flip-flopping between the two, enumerating against the two separate sites within my configuration. So if we log out of that now, and let's make things a little bit more interesting. So if we switch back to my web config file, and what we can do again is take the blank code block that we got before from the blog, and what we can do here is at the end of this user file mapping, we can copy and paste that into there. The first thing that we need to do, as I say, so we need to change the name of the user file mapping because it has to be an individual name. It can't be the same. And then what we'll do is we'll perform a failover configuration for the SP user. So initially we'll put in the domain and the group name SP. I'll grab the SID from my SID text file. Paste that in there. Excellent. Okay, so the equivalent farm set again is not that important to us in this environment. The load balance mode has to be failover, and the aggregation group again isn't that important. So here we go. So as we've now got it in failover mode, we've specified what we can do is put in Zen Desktop 1 here, and again we'll copy this configuration, add a new line, change it to Zen Desktop 2, and again we don't need any backup farm sets or anything within this configuration. Everything's still looking like it's closed out correctly, so we'll just save that configuration and switch back to our environment. So now if I log in as the SP user, what we should see is that we go directly to Zen Desktop 1 or XD7601 and we get our FrameHawk desktop. If I log out, log on again, same desktop. Let's do it one more time. and say in desktop. Now I'm going to log out now, and I'm going to log on to my Zendesk.76 farm. And now I'm going to stop the broker service. Okay, excellent. That's stopped. Now if we switch back to our storefront box and I log in again as the SP user, we've got it's enumerating now against the other Zen desktop site. So we've got our differing applications and desktops published, which again ideally you'd need to be identical, but for a lab environment it's an easier way to show you this. There we are. So that's basically the failover configuration. Okay, so from the example, let's move on to the aggregation scenario, where we're going to basically aggregate a list of identical applications into a single icon that's displayed to the user. So for this I need to do a little bit of work in my lab. So at the moment I've got Notepad published in one site but not in the other. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly do that and create the application delivery group for it. So bear with me just whilst I do that. And what you'll see here is I'm just adding everybody permissions to see this application, because the actual filtering comes from StoreFront and not from the published application or the desktop. Again, not best practice, but it's a lab, so take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, so I'm just going to publish out Notepad. And that's it. So all we need to do now is specify using keywords which one you want to be the primary one, which one you want to be the secondary one. So if we enter in keywords in here, and I'm going to set this one to be the primary. Okay. And then if we flick across to my other server, my other site, log into that. Okay, and into the delivery group, look at the applications. Let's edit the properties of the Notepad application, and we'll put in keywords here. Secondary, there we go. Now, keywords only work for primary and secondary, so there is no tertiary or anything, which is not a limitation, but something you need to be aware of. So now that's done, if we flip back to StoreFront, okay, so I'm going to reuse one of the groups that I've used previously for configuration. So let's go back into the user file mapping configuration. What we're going to do is I'm going to copy this user file mapping, and then we're going to build on this. So I'm going to reuse this particular portion, so I'm going to keep these top details the same. So we're going to use the SP group with that. User mapping 2 is fine. Location 1, load balance mode, if we keep that to, change that back to load balance now, just to keep it as we'd like it, and then I'm going to change the aggregation group, because this is what we're going to use to actually create this aggregation of resources from separate user file mapping configurations. I'm going to change that to something that I know and can replicate. So if we take out Zen Desktop 1, so we've got a single farm noted there, and then that's that for that particular configuration. So if we go in and paste that code block in again, so on the next bit of code block we need to change that again. So we've got 3 user mapping configurations now. Okay, so the rest bit we're going to keep the same as it was. The load balanced mode we need to change back to load balanced, just for ease of use in the lab. And then again, the aggregation group we're going to change to a friendly name that I can replicate. That's the same as the one in the previous user file mapping configuration. So for this instance, we're going to take out the first Zen Desktop reference, so that each user file mapping has a separate Zen Desktop site configured, and everything else is completed. I'll just check the bottom of the tags again, just to make sure they're still looking healthy and closed out correctly, which indeed they are. So let's now save the configuration and go back to StoreFront. Now, if we log in as our SP user, we should see that we should only have one Notepad application published to us. So here we've got a single Notepad instance available to the user, and that is coming from the Zen Desktop 1 farm. Because if you remember, if you had 2 separate sites into a standard StoreFront configuration, and they've got the same applications published, so if you've got a Notepad in one site and a Notepad in the other, what you'll see in StoreFront is you'll have a Notepad brackets 1 and then a Notepad brackets 2 within StoreFront, so the user won't know which farm it comes from and which one to pick. So with this way, you aggregate the resources together into one single icon available to the user, and you specify by the use of the primary and secondary keywords which farm you'd actually prefer this application to come from for the user. Okay, so that's our use cases covered, scenarios. I think you'll see that these are 3 very simplistic use cases. But what you can do within user file mapping, once you start playing with it, you realise it's very flexible. You can do a whole lot more with it. And as I say, within a recent project that we've been doing, I and another colleague have got the user file mapping to at least 80 separate user file mapping configurations within the store, with no degradation on performance, and it still works like a dream. It's brilliant. So with that now covered off, let's break it on purpose, and we'll show you some of the error messages that you can get. Right, so if I switch back to my configuration Notepad document, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the configuration for the user file mapping 1, so it's going to relate to the group HK user. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to put an error in each one of these, a case sensitivity error. So I'm just going to change the uppercase D to a lowercase d in both examples. So if we file and save this, and what you'll see is if I log in with the other user, the Singapore user, come on, password, there we go. It's all good, nothing wrong there at all. Works seamlessly as it should. If I log in with the HK user, we've got the very generic and awfully dreaded cannot complete your request. And what you will see is in the XML, the discovery services, you'll see these errors here. So you get an error 1 and an error 7. So it's basically saying it can't find the stores the farm configurations within the stores because of the case sensitivity issue. So now if we go in and fix that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in the leading slash to this configuration again, which is, if you remember, we removed that at the very start of the configuring user file mapping. We'll save that, and what you'll now see is a very similar message, even if I entirely refresh the page. Okay, so that's still getting a generic cannot complete your request error message. And if I now try to navigate through to the stores, you get a GUI error too. So it says unable to refresh, an error occurred, blah blah blah. And what you'll see in the delivery services there is you'll see a whole bunch of error messages, and it's basically telling you whereabouts within the config file that there's an error. It doesn't particularly tell you what the error is, but it gives you hints here, such as the start tags don't match with the end tags within this within the UFM config. So if we go back in and fix that particular configuration, and save it, what you'll notice is that the issue is immediately resolved. Once my lab actually refreshes, there we go. You can browse the store again, and I cannot complete your request messages go away. So once we've fixed those errors and got back to where we were, well, I'll show you a couple of limitations as well. Once you've got user file mapping configured in the web config, what that does do, it locks out your ability to actually make any changes through the GUI. So you see here we've got a view button for the delivery controllers. You can view the configuration, but there's no clicky buttons here. There's nothing you can do with it at all. This is because if you make any alterations to these delivery controllers, especially things like the name, the friendly name you give them, that will break user file mapping. So StoreFront locks that out by default, so you can't intentionally break it. To actually make changes to that configuration, what you have to do is go back to the web config, the same one that you actually used to set this up with, set user file mapping up with, and then you just find your Zen desktop site within the config. It's at the very start somewhere. Then you can make changes to the configuration here by the text file. Okay, so that's the basic run through of user file mapping and how it works and how you configure it end to end. As I say, I kind of created this video because I thought there's some great blog posts out there. There's a couple of really good ones, but I didn't see anything that actually gave you the full picture as such, and I've tried to create a fuller picture of actually the configuration. So I think some missed out things like the leading slash at the start of the config that you have to remove, and the bits at the end. And I think it was just having to configure it, and if you're new to user file mapping, you'd have to bring several blog posts together and kind of search for that information across several areas to actually get the full picture on how to do it. So if you managed to get this far in the video, thank you very much for watching. And if you need any more information, please go to my blog, which is vhorizon.co.uk, and there'll be a bit.ly link at the end of this video to get you there quickly. Thanks so much. Bye.